Okay, so in this video, I'm going to show you guys a bit about how the Flexbox container works. We're not going to do anything as far as building anything like you would on a page. This particular video, I just want to demonstrate a bit about how the Flexbox container works. In the previous video, if you'd watched it, we showed how to make this header, and I did utilize a bit of Flexbox properties in order to line things up, such as the logo here, and then also the nav bar. So in this video, I just kind of wanted to do some demonstrations on the various Flexbox properties and how they work, and to just give you a better idea of the whole flow of things so you guys get a better understanding of how to align content on the page and how to structure things in here. So I'm just going to get started here, and I'm going to pick the Flexbox. And for the selector structure, I'm going to start with the direction row. So we got this right here, and then I'm just going to leave this box setting as it is, 1100 pixels, and then I'm just going to give this container, say, 100 pixels. I'm using the pencil so that way I can use different measurements on different ones. If you use just pixels or one of these only, then you have to use that exact same measurement on all fours, but I don't want to do that, so that's one big reason why I like using this pencil here, especially where I use this max property here, which I talked about in the header video. So I'm just going to use that on the right and the left right here. And then I'm going to add a container in here, another one that's going to be nested inside. So I'll just call this one boxes container. I like to label things. You probably saw me do that in the header as well. I'm going to call this a box item. And then for this box item, one thing I like to do is assign it classes in case I ever have to apply a little custom CSS to them later on. So I'll just give this a name of box for a class name. It's not going to do anything. I'm just assigning a class to it, which the class has no properties assigned to it yet. So then what I want to do by default when you put an item inside of a container, or even just a container itself, is it's going to take up 100% of the width. Now right here, it's stopping short here and there because of the padding I set. And then same on the top and bottom while you have this gap, which is what you want. So as the content grows and shrinks in height, you always maintain a gap along the top, bottom, and the sides, just like what we did in the header. So right here for this box item, I'm just going to give it width of 160 pixels, and then I'm going to give it a min height 160 as well, just to give it a square box. And then I'll get rid of this, margin and padding, get rid of that 8 pixel padding monster like I talked about. And then I'm just going to give it a color. I'll just give it this. And then inside of it, I'm going to add just a text thing here, get rid of this lorem ipsum text, give it a number of 1, change this to white, and then go a little bigger on that. Give it, say, 1.125 rem, which calculates out to 18 pixels. I like to use rems because then it's a multiplying factor of the root HTML tags font size, so that way certain people, when they adjust their font size settings in their browser, they can make certain text get bigger or smaller. So usually the base HTML starting font size is 16 pixels, so 16 times 1.125 calculates out to 18 pixels. So I'll just do that, and I'll just make it center there. And then I'll go ahead and copy that, just duplicate this, make 3 of these. So now I got 3 box items inside of this box container. That 2, and I'll give that 3. So now I want to go back to the boxes container that houses all these box items in there. So if we go to layout here, this is where a lot of your controls for Flexbox are. You have some also in here for controlling each item. I'll get into those in a little bit with the box items. But I wanted to start right here. And as I selected earlier, when I selected which layout would you like to use, there was Flexbox here, had the option of column or row. So right now, since I picked row, that's what it's starting off as. And what the direction is tells what way you want that container to span. In this case, a row, it's spanning from left to right. Hence why these items in here are going from left to right, because that's the direction we specified. If I hit column, and this is a lot of times what it does by default when you add just a container in there without doing this add right here, column, obviously, it will stack. And this is normally what would happen if you weren't using Flexbox at all. Let's just say some other building tool, it would, with the display block model, everything would normally stack. So then you have the column to vertically stack, and then you also have row reverse, which will take the items and put them in reverse order. So it kind of put them over at the end here, but if you notice, it's going 3, 2, 1 instead of 1, 2, 3 like on the regular. And then you also have column reverse, which you can probably guess what's going to happen when I do that. They're going to stack like they did here on the regular column, but the numbers are obviously reversed because you're reversing the order of the items. So it's kind of a nice way to reverse things, especially on different screen sizes, if you want the order to change without having to make another container and copy all those items again just to have one for a different screen size. You can reduce the amount of markup or the amount of content you need to put on your page and be able to just dynamically sort of change them around like this without having to have two copies of it, one for one screen size and one for another. So that's pretty much how the direction works. Now the next thing I want to show is justify content. Now the default for that, it doesn't show which one it is, but it is start right now. If I hit center, you notice these items moved towards the center. Justify content pertains to how to space things with the extra space that it has along the directional axis, or what's known as the main axis. So when I hit justify content, it's going to adjust how these things are spaced apart with the extra space along this row from left to right. Now, obviously, if I shrunk this down, this main container down, then not much would happen because there's not much space for it to move, as you can see right there. So it only works when there's extra space available. So you have this whole span here. So then we tell it, okay, what do we want to do with that extra space? We have start, we have center, we have end, and then we have some other properties that are pretty nice. This one right here being space between. Now I kind of wanted to load this on another page just to kind of show you guys what's going on here. Load that. And what space between does is it creates space in between all the elements except for the beginning and the end. Because you notice there's no space over here, there's no space over there, and this green area is the padding we defined to maintain, the space inside this box content here. So there's a couple other ones. There's space around. If I save that, it's a little bit like space between, but if you notice here, space around is creating space before the first one and after the last one. And if you really look at it, it's the same amount of space that goes halfway between this one and this one here. So it's equivalent. This space here is the same amount. It's going from here to here, same with that one to that one. So it's kind of creating an even half space on the beginning and the end. And then you also have space evenly, which just evens out the space even more. So then now you have the even amount of space here between this, before this first one and after this last one, as you do in between the first, the second, and the third. So that's pretty much how justify content works. Now, if we switch this direction here, where you saw it stack earlier, now the justify content pertains to this directional axis going this way as opposed to going this way, because we changed the direction. It's doing it based upon the main axis, the main direction we specified. Now right now it's not doing anything because the height of this container, in fact, I'll do this for you guys. It's right here so you can see the space of this actual container. is the height of the container is set based upon the content. So as you saw earlier where I shrunk the width down and it didn't do anything, there's no extra space in between. So right now these aren't going to do anything. But if I increase the height where the height is greater than the height of these three boxes, let's say I do, say 1000. And now if I hit center, you notice they're doing the same thing as we saw before, but going this way vertically, because now this is the main axis because we changed the direction. And then the same thing will happen if we do end, space between, space around. Pretty much the same thing, just going vertically. So I'll change this back. And I want to show you guys the next thing, which is align items. Now, just like we had justify content, we were controlling things along whatever axis we specified in the direction. Align items controls the aligning of things along the cross axis or the perpendicular axis to this the row direction that we have specified. So now when we set it to row, it's going to do everything perpendicular or vertically. So you probably noticed that these boxes stretched, and the default property is stretch. That will cause, all the items' height to be the same as the content container. Now, if I knock that down, let's say I knock the min height down, then it goes back to just being the 100 pixels that it's specified, because now the Flexbox root container is setting its height based on the height of the content. But if we go, let's just do 600 pixels here. Actually, you know what? Let's do 700. I'll show you some more align items properties. So if we hit start, now you kind of notice that it's sort of aligning things along the cross axis or the vertical here. So I have similar properties. I have start, center. We don't have the space between like we do on the main justify content axis when across the row, but we have start, center, and end. And then we have the stretch, which is what you saw that it was doing by default. So right now I'll set this to center. So that pretty much covers the align items properties and how they work. Now the next one is the gaps property. Now by default it will set it to 20 pixels on the columns and the rows. But what I can do, I'm going to change that to 0. And then I'm going to set this back to start, or I can even do center right here. And you notice it just looks like 1, and that's because they're all butting up to each other, because before I had a gap of 20 pixels in between. That's why you were seeing that space. But if I take that off, it's not there. So now I can do something like 60 pixels here across the column, and then 60 pixels across the row. And you can even use the lock one here, and it will just set the gap. Now, before you'd have to use things like, margins and stuff to create these gaps in between. But sometimes what could happen is, when you had you had three boxes in your desktop and then you wanted to do 2, you were oftentimes having to keep switching things up on, say, margin, left and right here. But then if this stacked, then you had to change it to margin top and bottom. Using these gaps just makes it a whole lot easier, where you don't have to worry about setting margins on each and every individual one. So that pretty much is how the gaps property works. Now, the last one, at least for this section here, for the container properties, is one called wrap. Now, right now, it's set to, I believe, no wrap is the default. So if I create more of these boxes, and you notice as I create more and more of them, they're all just sort of lining up, and they're kind of shrinking down, because right now they're set not to wrap. It's going to try to fill as all the items that the container has across this row. Same thing if I did them in a column where they stack. It's just going to try to fit them all in. Now, what if we don't want that to happen? What if the width that we've defined, 160 pixels, we want that to be able to sort of move down to the next line and not get all squishy like this? Well, there's a property called wrap right here. And let me take this down because it kind of creates that gap. So you notice they're kind of, these ones went down here and they maintained their size. They didn't shrink up. So what happened was it fit as many as it could, being 160 pixels wide plus the 24 pixel gap. And then any that it couldn't fit, it put on the next line. Now, because we set the justify content to center, they went center. You can do start, center, end, and then just to show you, when I shrink, they just wrap. So it's a nice way to make things responsive. Now right here, Elementor by default will set items to be 100% on mobile, which is below the 768 mark right here. I can zoom in a little more to show you. You kind of look there. So what I can do is go back here, shrink this down, delete these. Take them back to, let's just do 4 for now. And then if I have that wrap right here, I can set these on mobile to each be the 160 pixels instead of the 100% that Elementor is setting by default. So now this flex wrap helps makes it responsive. So now 4 columns wide, when it's not able to fit 4 of them across at each 160 pixels, it just wraps them to the next line. And it does a nice wrap all the way down to mobile. This is obviously way smaller than you'd ever go. I think the smallest you'd probably go is right about here, around 340 pixels. So yeah, that's a bit summary of how the these properties work for the main parent container of the items. Now you can even go a little further. Now these box items too are also Flexbox containers as well, so you can access some of the same properties. So you notice these numbers here, they're the counter at top. We can center those up by these box items. We can hit center. The default right now, the direction is column. That's why it just did that without me having to set it. So I can set these to center, just like that. So you can have Flexbox containers nested within containers. You could nest several layers deep, and there's just a lot of stuff you can do with them to align content within a box, within another box, and so on and so forth. So now I want to get into some of the properties in Flexbox for the items themselves. So if we click here, now obviously this is setting it for content inside of it, but if we want to alter things within this actual box itself, we can click on something called Advanced, or the Advanced tab I should say. And if you notice, there's properties that say Align Self, there's also Order, and then there's also Size, and I'm going to cover those right now. So I'm going to give this main container some height right here. I'm going to say, let's just give it 700 pixels to give it some height to work with. And as we saw earlier with the the align properties going this way, one thing we can do, let's say we want all of these to just kind of be at the top going here, but we want, say, number 3 to kind of be down here at the bottom. What we can do is we can set something known as Align Self. So right now they're at the start, but if I hit center, I can make this go towards the center of the container. And then I can also hit end. I can also hit stretch. Let's say I wanted to make this also stretch as well. I could hit the same thing. So it works the same as align items. It just allows you to set the property on each individual item itself. So it's just a nice little additional perk if you want to make something different. And this can really come in handy, the align self. Let's say this is a common thing that I've seen happen. It's happened to me, especially when I was first learning it. Let me get rid of that flex wrap so it kind of comes up along here. Let's say we have an image. Sorry, this is taking a little bit to go. So let's have this image of a person. Right now it's looking pretty good because it's set its height, it set its aspect ratio proportionately. But what would happen if we decided to shrink this down, let's say to 200? And for these items, because we have them line items start, they're lining at the top. What if we did stretch? And let's say we wanted this to, let me do something here. Let's say we wanted the image to take up the full height. Well, we have an issue here because now it's being stretched. So one thing that can help mitigate this is the align self. Say on an image, if you don't want it stretching like that, or if you notice an image is stretchy, you can set align self to center, and usually that'll help with that. And I can shrink this down a little more. Normally you wouldn't have it that extreme, but let's say you had, cards and you had an image here and you noticed the image was kind of stretching like this a little bit, you can just set align self to center to help fix with that. So now the next property I want to show is the order. Now the order, you kind of saw something like that change when I used the row reverse and the column reverse on the container item. But right here, we can do things where we can change the order up. We could set it to, 2, or let's say 1. I could say this one I want to be 3, 4. You can just kind of change things up a bit. So now I'm going to change that back. And this is a good property to use, especially when you have things stacked on different screen sizes, without having to, again, create another container with the same content just to make it accommodate for mobile. You can kind of switch the orders up in which they'll go on each of the individual items themselves. So that's pretty much what the order does. Pretty straightforward. You can do start, end, or just set a custom order however you want to do it. So I'm just going to change that back. And then finally, there's one called size. And right now, they're just sort of the widths of them. The flex sizing has to do with the way they size going across the main directional axis. So I'm going to change this here. Sorry about that. Actually, I already had it accordingly. I'm going to set these to center just to make it a little easier to see it. And I'm going to delete box number 4 just to make a little extra room for this. I'll save this real fast. So you have grow, you have shrink, and you have custom. So I'll show you the first one. The first one is grow. Now what grow does is it's going to make that item grow and fill up whatever available space there is in the container space. So if we look here, because we put grow on this one, it's width grew in size to fill up any remaining space that there was inside of the Flexbox container. These ones did not. They stayed the same because we didn't set a grow property on them. So usually, in a lot of cases, let's say you want 3 boxes to be even and you want it to fill up the entire space. You don't want them to just be sort of restricted down like they were before to only 160 pixels. You can put the flex grow property, and now as you can see, they're all evenly growing to fill in the available space in the container. And then if I shrink these down, they will shrink down to 160 pixels accordingly, because that's what we set the initial width to. Now we can set them to grow at different rates. Actually, before I do that, I'll show you the shrink. So there is the shrink as well. I don't think the shrink... Okay, yeah, so actually the shrink doesn't really seem to do much good if the other ones are set to grow. So let me try this. Because honestly, I haven't messed around too much with the shrink. Usually it's the grow, or I may set the custom right here. But if I set shrink. And let's say I give this one a little more width. Let's say 400. Oh, I didn't want to do that. The shrink should cause this to get smaller. And it does right there. Right now it's kind of that breakpoint because I only had this 160 pixels. That affects how much it's going. So the shrink affects how much it's going to shrink. So it doesn't get any bigger than the 400 pixels we specified, but shrink will cause it to get smaller. It affects how much it's going to shrink down. Whereas normally by default, and this is kind of the weird thing, I believe they already kind of have a shrink. So at this point, I don't really use the shrink very much. Let's just this back to 160. Same here. So probably wouldn't recommend using the shrink much, but I'll show you another property here, and that is the flex grow and the flex shrink. This kind of allows you to customize how you want to do it. So let's say you want one to grow a bit more than the other. So let's say I do grow, shrink we won't worry too much about. And so one thing you can do here is, let's say I gave this grow 2, the rest of these are 1. And then if you notice, the rate in which they grow, the second one is growing, is faster. Because you notice how when I shrink to this point, they're all going down to their base 160 pixels. But as I get wider, you notice how, because I set flex grow of 2 on the second one, how it's growing at a faster rate compared to the first and the third one. Now I could do something like this just to illustrate a little more. So the first one, now I've set that, what was I set that to 4. So now as we get wider, this first one is growing at a faster rate than these, and the second one, because it's set to 2, is growing faster than 3 because the flex grow is 2 and this one is set to 1. So you kind of have a starting, the width you set is sort of a starting basis, and Flexbox has a property called flex basis as well, where you have a certain width you want to start with, and then you can set your flex grow and flex shrink to show how much you want it to grow and shrink from that starting point. So I'm going to change these all back. And that's, for the most part, how Flexbox works. That's pretty much, all the properties that you'll be using in a nutshell. Now I'll show you one other thing. Oftentimes, let's say you have a whole bunch of these right here, and let's say you got the flex wrap on. Do a few more. And suddenly you're told, hey, we've got to make these boxes a little bit bigger than what they currently are. Sometimes it can be a little tedious to be going into every single one of these and defining these one at a time. That is one little drawback with these Elementor controls, is that you're kind of doing everything like you would inline styling. So if you remember early on how I set that CSS class of box, what you can do, this is sort of a cheat way, and this is something that I commonly do, especially when you got a bunch of items. You can go on here. Now you can type selector, because this uses something called post CSS, so it'll automatically figure out what element it is, and then we can do box. So then we're saying this container, all the items that have the class of box, we can set a width on them. Well, actually, we can do this. We can use something that we set a flex basis on, let's say 500 pixels, and then we can set a grow and a shrink rate on them. In fact, actually, it's that way. So if you have to change all these, sometimes when you got a lot of them, it's just easier to apply custom CSS to them. So then I can do this, set the flex grow. So this property right here, let me show more. This is one that you can custom CSS in. And that grow and that shrink property that I saw, this is the rate of growth, this is the rate of shrink, and then this is what that starting width is that it will grow and shrink based on. So let's say if I didn't want these to grow, they kind of just all stay the same here. If I want them to grow, I can set them like that. If I don't want them to shrink, then if I go here, then they shouldn't shrink smaller than 160 pixels. Now, usually I don't always, I generally don't do that. I usually like to have a shrink on there, so the screen size gets really small below 300 pixels plus the padding you have on the side. It'll just kind of shrink below that. But I just wanted to show you guys that when you have a large quantity of them, or let's say you're doing something with blog posts, sometimes it's better to just apply custom CSS, especially when it's something dynamic like blog posts, where it's just going to take us however many you have and just automatically sort of, loop through and map them out. It's good to know some of the custom CSS properties. And I'll also link in the description below a video a bit about how Flexbox works if you're just hand coding, because this Flexbox stuff is really just part of native CSS. This is just sort of Elementor's way of utilizing it. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I know it was a little long, but yeah, I'll link that other video in the description below that shows you a bit more how to do Flexbox with custom CSS. So if you ever have a large quantities of this, you know how to handle it in custom CSS as well, along with the Elementor properties that I showed you. So just to kind of summarize, we talked about the container, we talked about the direction, how you can span across a row or you can span across a column. You can reverse the order, how you're kind of seeing here. You can column reverse the order. Then you also have the justify content. I'll take this off real quick, actually. Justify content along this main axis here, and then you have the align items along here. Of course, I don't have enough height for them to do anything. You have the start and you have the stretch for those. And then, of course, you had the other properties like the align self and also these gaps right here. This one right here, it's creating quite a bit of a gap. I'm not really sure why it's doing that, but I'll change this back. Get rid of the wrap, and then I'll set the height back to 800. And just to recap again, the flex properties on each item, you have the align self, so you can set one to start, center, end, or stretch. I also showed you that example with an image. So if you had an image as one of the items, sometimes you may have issues with it stretching. So if you use the align self center or start or end, usually that will help alleviate that issue of image stretching. So yeah, there was also the order as well. We showed that. And then also, of course, the sizing. So that's pretty much, for the most part, all the features of Flexbox. I know that's quite a bit of information, but yeah, feel free to watch this video several times and keep on practicing. And yeah, check out the video also that I'm going to put in the description below for more custom CSS ways of working with Flexbox.